Thank you for coming back to Cuidado, the podcast that helps you to avoid the pitfalls of life and enable you to live a winning life. Today, I'm going to be looking at Moses and seeing how Moses made moves and changes in his life. Moses, when we see him first in scripture, was born at a time and season where death reigned for the children of Israel, because the Pharaoh of Egypt had made a decree that every baby boy born in Israel was to be killed. And so, just entering this earth, Moses entered it facing death. And Moses overcame death because he was assigned a mother with wisdom. He couldn't make a decision for himself at that time. He couldn't choose what to do and how to do it. But God, in his infinite wisdom, gave him to a mother that had the determination and the will to cause Moses to escape death. He gave her the wisdom that it would require to make a move that would allow Moses to get past death in a season when Moses could have been killed, because Moses had a call and a purpose that had to be completed, and it would take wisdom moves to get Moses to where he was. So God specifically gave him to a mother that would move him when he could not move himself. Then we see that Moses' mother's move was to put him in a place that was not the safest place to put him, but the most visible place. She placed him in the Nile River, knowing that it would not necessarily keep him safe by the river that she placed him, but she knew the God that had given him to her was his safety net, and she knew that God would determine what would happen to him. So what she did was she took it out of her own hands, what became of Moses, and she gave him back to the Savior and the Deliverer that had given her a boy child when he knew that child could be killed. But because she recognized that if he gave her a child at a time when death was reigning against him because of his gender, then she knew that God had entrusted this child to her for a time such as this. And so she made a specific move that would allow God to be the one to determine what happened to Moses. She was giving him back to God by entrusting his life to him. And she left him at the riverbanks with his sister, hidden in the bushes to see what would come of him. It was a faith move that meant that what God did would determine the outcome. She placed Moses where he could be seen, and she placed Moses' sister, her daughter, where she could not be seen, because she was taking the visibility away from the daughter to ensure that Moses would be seen, while the the child who was hidden could report on what was happening, and to allow her to continue to be in his life so that she would continue to play a part in directing Moses' steps. God chose his mother not just for her to have Moses in a season and then give him up, but because she was the one who birthed him. She was the one who could also be assigned to continue in his life as a nanny. So she was also a mother to him while he was living in Pharaoh's house, a mother of Israel, to raise him in the Israelite way of life, to direct him according to God's step. So Moses' mother's purpose in this continued because she had the wisdom to take a step back and be hidden at a time when it was needed so that she could receive the will of God in Moses' life through directed purpose. Through her daughter's report, the hiding was specific for the requirement at that time. Her daughter hid because she needed to be out of sight at that time so that the mother could be assigned, because she was the one who made the suggestion to call a mother of Israel to be Moses' nanny, to be the mother that would be over him even while he was still in there. Meaning, you have to know when it is time for you to take a step back and just watch God move. You have to know when it is time for you to allow God to move so that you take a back seat. You take your hands out of the pot and allow God to be the one to stir it. Allow God to be the one that takes action and make the moves to ensure that his will be done. Moses' mother knew she was not the one moving Moses. It was God's moving Moses, because God was his purpose. Moses was God's purpose for her life, and Moses was called for a specific purpose in that time and season for her people. And moving into a back seat, taking a back seat, was what she was called to do to ensure Moses would fulfill his purpose. Know when God is telling you to move out of the way and take a back seat and allow his will to be done. Allow him to take the actions to move the purpose according to his will, because you can't move it. You don't know how to move. You don't know the moves to make. And if you continue to try to be the one to stir the pot, you're going to make a mess. You're going to disturb what is there in such a way that instead of you promoting God's will, what you're going to do is cause what God is doing to be hidden, to be what is hidden, and you are going to promote your self-will. Move out of God's way and let him be the one to take the action steps that need to be done. You don't need to find ways to make things move. You don't need to figure out what to do, what next steps to take. What you need to do is to sit back and allow God. You need to be hidden. And when God has made his move, you will know when it is time for you to step forward, like that little girl who was hidden in the bush, and make a suggestion that she go call a mother. You will know when it is time for you to step to the forefront and be able to make the decision that need to be made to continue in God's will and purpose. Your hiding right now is God's will and purpose. Where you are, though you are not in the forefront, though you can't be seen, it is God's will for you right now to be hidden. It is how the purpose will progress without you being seen. Take a back seat and be hidden in the time when God is telling you to be hidden. Of all the people in the land of Egypt, it was the Pharaoh's sister that saw Moses and took Moses to be her own. God's wisdom not only it shows that he chose where Moses should be, but he chose who would get Moses, who would raise Moses, and where Moses would be, because God's infinite wisdom directs our paths based on his knowledge of us, based on of his intentionality concerning our lives. Moses' steps right here was already being guided by God to determine the outcomes in his life. God chose the paths that Moses' steps would follow based on when Moses was born, what happened in that season, and what actions were taken to ensure his life was preserved and to ensure that his life would go along the path that God intended for him. The purpose of God here, the will of God here, is what was directing Moses' life, so that the fulfillment of God's purpose was what caused Moses' life to take the path that it took. Moses' life being determined by God meant Moses' actions followed God's will, God's purpose and direction, because God made the moves that would allow him to move. God sent Moses to visit the children of Israel when it was time for purpose to move in another direction. When things need to move in another direction, it is when God's will moves it and causes direction to take place, and causes the direction that God wills to move things according to the perspective of the will of God. When Moses was born was one chapter. When God allowed his mother to place him by the river, that was another direction that the purpose was taken. When God caused the Pharaoh's daughter to take Moses out of that river, that was another direction. And here when Moses made a move and went into Israel to visit, God was causing the purpose to take another direction. Each direction was another chapter being opened by the Lord, because the will of God determines each chapter and the direction that each chapter must take. It is God that is doing the writing and determines the chapters. To God be the glory. Moses got into Israel, and when he got into Israel, what Moses saw happening made Moses do something that caused another direction, another chapter to open up, to cause the purpose to take another direction. Moses took action based on what he saw, telling us that what he saw had been determined by God. It was God's will for Moses to be in the place he was at the time that was happening. It was no coincidence, it was no accident that Moses got into Israel at that specific time. God was the one who gave Moses the time that he went to visit his family in Israel. It was God putting it in him. It was God saying to him, go into Israel, because God knew what he would come upon, what would be happening at the time, and God knew the actions Moses would take, and God knew the direction that the purpose would go in, to tell us that even though it seemed as if Moses took the wrong action, because the purpose took such a drastic change in direction, Moses' life took such a drastic change, such a different path, that it would seem as if God's hand wasn't in this. It seemed as if God wasn't the one who was making the move, who was making the determination of what was happening here. But just because the change seems to be a negative change, or a change in a direction that you did not will or did not expect, does not mean it is not God's hand that is directing your steps and determining your path. It is God's will that is moving you out of the place where you are at, because his timing is specific for what needs to be done. And he had to get Moses out of that place at that time, because Moses had become what he had been brought up in. He had become he had taken on the mindset and the culture of Egypt more than that of Israel, because he was in the fear of the house. He knew who he was. That is why he took the steps that he did. He knew he was the deliverer for Israel, and he had that expectation for his life. And that is why Moses did what he did, because he was showing himself to be the deliverer to Israel. He was proving himself at that time. And so he took action based on who he believed himself to be in God, based on his calling. But the actions he took was more based on the culture that he grew up in than the culture of the God whom he served. When Moses killed an Egyptian, he did what Egypt would do, not what Israel would do. Egypt was a conquering nation who believed and who practiced conquering other nations by killing and destroying. Moses killing that Egyptian was doing what Egypt did to conquer, what Egypt did to promote themselves, to show their authority and power in the earth at that time. So Moses was coming out of hiding in the Egyptian palace where God had placed him. He was showing up and showing himself, and that would cause the Egyptians to recognize who he was, to cause his death in a time when it was not the right timing for Moses, because he had become arrogant in his calling to decide for himself when he was going to move and what steps he was going to take. And he was doing it based on Egypt's culture, based on what the world taught him. Egypt in the Bible represents the world. And so he was taking steps based on what the word told him is how to achieve his purpose and his call. He was doing what Egypt did to conquer enemies, not to rule in dominion like God nation would. So God had to move Moses at that time to a new place, because he had taken the covering off of himself. He had come out of hiding, and God had to send him somewhere else into a different culture to hide him away from Egypt's power to kill. Power to kill, steal, and destroy. That is what Egypt was at that time. The identity that Moses took on was the identity to kill, to steal, and to destroy. When they conquered, they took everything of any nation that they conquered and call it their own. They were being conquerors that kill, steal, and destroyed to gain their own. Hallelujah. They were taken from others to gain their own identity, to gain power from putting down others. And that was not God's will for Moses, and it is not God's will for you. When you become a conqueror who is promoting yourself to cause yourself to move, it is not God's will. Showing others how big they are so that they can conquer, they belittle, they step on others, putting them under their feet. That is what the people who conquer by killing, stealing, and destroying does. God calls us a conqueror, and more than a conqueror, through Christ. Christ never killed, never steal, and never destroyed. In fact, he went to the slaughter like a lamb. Trying to do God's will on your own causes you to destroy others when you are moving in your own season and timing and outside of God's will, outside of God's timing and purpose. Don't move. Be still. Stay where you are. It is God's hiding. God is hiding you in a place that is specific to the purpose and the call that he has for you. Moses was hiding in Egypt because Moses had to know Egypt's culture. He had to understand how the Egyptians operated, how they thought. He had to understand it. He was not supposed to become them. He was hidden to ensure that he received revelation and understanding concerning God's will and God's purpose, concerning how God would move when it was God's time. He was there because he was hiding among them so that they would not know who he is. Because when the call came, he would be a threat to them, and that threat they would try to conquer in the way that they conquered, to kill Moses. That is why when Moses recognized that the Pharaoh would come to know that he killed that Egyptian, he fled right away. He fled so quickly, not taking time to say goodbye to anyone, to collect any of the things that he owned. He never went back into Egypt to the Pharaoh's house to collect anything, to say goodbye or thank you to the woman that raised him as her own in the Pharaoh's house, his Egyptian mother. He just fled because he knew the threat that was against him. He had learned the lesson well. The problem was that he became them. He took on the identity of Egypt and never learned the ways of Israel. And he was promoting God's call out of season and identifying himself to cause himself to become a target. God's hiding is his protection. It's his will for the time and the season that you are in, to hide. God caused Moses to flee because the actions that Moses took, his self-promotion, his self-will, caused him to be seen and gave him over to the will of the enemy, so the hands of the enemy could destroy him. He brought on himself the destruction of the enemy because he stepped out of God's season and timing. And it caused him to have to flee. But as I said, God's will was being done because God knew Moses was growing more impatient in the Pharaoh's house. The actions he took told you he had become more impatient with waiting on God. It told you that he had become more self-assured and arrogant, self-sure of himself in his own will. And therefore he was going to do what he did in some way. So God took the preemptive action of causing him to come upon an Egyptian when he was outside of the reach of the Pharaoh, because God was ensuring that when Moses did what he did, he could not be reached by the enemies that would destroy him. God had to take him outside of Pharaoh's reach when he made the move to promote himself, to make sure that he could get away in time to prevent his death, to prevent them destroying him. So God's will at that time was to move Moses out of the hiding he had him, out of the place of hiding he was in, because God knew that Moses' action would cause Moses to become a threat to Egypt, and that threat they would put down in no uncertain terms. They would put down in the way that they are used to, the way their culture did things. God's provision for the purpose at that time was that God had to make the move for Moses. He pushed Moses into the situation that caused Moses to take the action that was already in his will, in his heart. God knows the heart. So God's preemptive action was that he pushed Moses to do what he knew, what God knew Moses would do. God pushed him to move him out of the way, because God remained. That was how God remained in control of the situation. God was moving the purpose, giving direction to the purpose. Moses fled into the wilderness to give himself the security that he needed at a time and a season when he needed it. God took him out of Egypt and put him in a place where his hiding became again the identity he took on. In the wilderness, God completely changed Moses' identity, where Moses was so unrecognizable that even to himself, he did not see himself in the light of God's calling anymore, because Moses had taken on the perspective that he was a shepherd and a husband. His hiding was that Moses no longer saw himself as being the one to deliver Israel. Instead, he saw himself as being a shepherd who herded sheep. The identity had been blocked in his mind, in his will. The perception of himself had changed so that he measured himself according to where he was instead of according to God's calling and God's will. Because God's will at that time for him was for him to perceive himself based on the place he was in, to allow him to take the call of God in a direction that God intended it to go. Where Moses was brought Moses into a different kind of identity that allowed Moses to see himself as a shepherd, where he was guiding sheep. The sheep became the ones he was sent to deliver. So his hiding took his calling. His hiding took him to a place where his perspective of being a deliverer changed to mean that Moses' hiding caused the will of God to change in him. He no longer saw himself as being the deliverer meant to conquer, the deliverer meant to put down others, the deliverer meant to take control and to take charge and to show power and authority, to bring things under his own authority and control. Instead, now Moses saw himself in the light of a shepherd. God is a shepherd, so he described himself as a shepherd in Psalm 23. So it shows us that Moses now was being trained in the light of whom God was, to take on the mindset of God that would allow Moses to guide, to lead based on God's will and God's ways. He was gaining understanding in a new light. He was gaining understanding based on the call of God for him. The will of God was being done in Moses in this place. Egypt was a hiding to develop in him the understanding of the enemy he would have to face. The wilderness was a place for him to develop the understanding of what it means to be God's deliverer, of what it means to work in the purpose of God, to take on the will of God from the mindset of being a shepherd to sheep. Sheep has been described so often are docile sheep. Sheep don't lead themselves. They just follow what their leader said. And their own understanding comes from what the leader tells them. They don't direct themselves. It is the shepherd that directs them. It is the shepherd that guides them. They take on the will of shepherd, and their shepherd is who protects them. Everything about the sheep is dependent on the shepherd. And Moses had to come to that place where he could be depended on by the sheep, because Israel, God calls them children of Israel. Children take their identity from their parents. They depend on their parents to guide them, to lead them. They depend on their parents to be the ones that show them what is to be done, what is God's will concerning them. So Moses had to be in a place where he could identify with God's will concerning him. It changed his perspective altogether, and it meant that Moses no longer saw himself as a conqueror. He didn't believe anymore in being able to conquer and put down others, because his perspective concerning himself had changed so much by the will of God. He no longer thought that he was able to kill others, to kill, to steal, and to destroy, because he no longer saw himself in the identity of the enemy who had formed his mind based on the enemy's intent of destroying him, in keeping him from doing God's purpose. And so Moses was taken out of a place where he could destroy his own self, that self-destructive path that the enemy was guiding him on through the identity in his mind, because the enemy was using God's purpose to make Moses see himself as being the one who was all powerful, who was seeing himself like the enemy saw his own self, as the one who could conquer God, who could take the throne of God. In other words, he was replacing God. He was making himself God. He was using Moses' purpose to make Moses make himself his own God. And that's a path of destruction, because you neither have the power nor the authority of God. And it puts you in a place where the enemy has control of your life. It is the enemy's destruction that he is working in your life to destroy you, so he destroys God's purpose. Moses' identity became God's will in a place that was a wilderness, a place where he lost, it would seem, all sense of himself, because now he had taken on the humility of God. That is what losing yourself is. But a lot of the time when we are losing ourselves and walking in the humility of God, we feel as if our life has no real purpose or direction, because it strips our minds of self-will, of self-purpose, self-gain. It strips our mind of our own control and authority. And so it sometimes makes you feel as if you have no self-esteem, you have no purpose or direction for your life. But in the place where you are is God's will to develop you in the identity and the call of God as being humble as a lamb. Christ was as humble as a lamb. The shepherd became one of the lambs that he guided. He had to take on the mannerisms of the lamb. He had to become like the lamb he was trying to guide. As Paul said in the book of Corinthians, Paul said, to the weak I became as weak, that I might be made all things to all men. He became what they were, so that they could see in him the light of Christ, so that they could see themselves in him. They could see how he was a part of them, how he was sent to them. The sheep has to recognize the voice of the shepherd to follow him. And if they don't, they will fear the shepherd and hide from the shepherd. It will cause the sheep to scatter, because the shepherd voice has to be recognized by the sheep. The shepherd has to become like a lamb, so that the sheep will not fear the shepherd, because the voice of the shepherd is recognizable. The shepherd smells like the sheep when he's among them, so that his scent causes him to be recognized as being a part of them, and so that they will allow him to come into their fold, to be among them, and they will not be scattered because of fear and put to flight in their fear. Moses had to be recognized as being among the sheep, because he had taken on the identity of the call of God. When Moses went on to Egypt and he killed that Egyptian, if you recall in the story, he was rejected by Israel, because it was an Israelite that said to him, Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian? Even though what he was trying to do was to separate them, to keep them from fighting among themselves, right? Even though what he was doing was trying to help them, they turned against him and rejected him. And they said, who made you ruler over us? Because they did not recognize Moses. He didn't smell like them. He didn't sound like them. He didn't sound like a sheep. He wasn't baying. He was growling like a wolf, because he seemed like a wolf in sheep clothing, because the clothing he had on was from Egypt, literally. He was dressed more like an Egyptian than like a shepherd, than like an Israelite. So the smell that came off of him, he was raised among Egypt, therefore he smelled like Egypt. He sounded like Egypt. The actions that he took showed him to be like Egypt. So his mannerisms was like Egypt. His behavior, his way of speaking, his self-promotion right there identified him with their enemy and not with them. And so they ran from him. It caused the people he believed in himself called to help to scatter. They ran. They fled from his voice. They fled from his actions, because how he treated them seems to be more in line with Egypt. He was taking action to stop a fight, but they feared that he would kill them, that he had killed the Egyptian. The fact that he was able and willing to kill an Egyptian said a lot, because an Israelite would never take a step like that, because they know the detriment of that action. They know to take an action like that, what would happen to them. So they would never kill an Egyptian and hiding in the sand amongst others when other people could see what they were doing, because Moses did it. And when he did it in the open, even though he looked around and he thought no one was seeing him. They would know where others would see them was in the open, and they would never take a chance like that, because it would mean their life. They understood that, but Moses didn't, because he believed himself to be among Egypt. He didn't align with Egypt, with Israel way of life. He didn't think like Israel. He didn't see himself as Israel saw him. And what I meant was, he didn't align himself with Israel. He didn't think like Israel. He did not identify with the way of life that they had to live as servants, as slaves in Israel. He was a master in his mind, because Egypt was a master, and that was his way of operating. So they couldn't identify him as being a servant and a slave like themselves. He was a master, and they knew that him being a master mean he could kill them. They saw in him that ability to kill and to destroy them, just as they saw in an Egyptian. He was their enemy, not their friend. They didn't accept him nor received him. That is why they rejected him in the manner they did. He was not one of them. They didn't see him they saw him as a ruler over them, not as a deliverer. They were asking him, Who made you a deliverer? Who made you a ruler over us? Is what they ask him. As a deliverer, he had to be one of them. He had to speak their language, and they didn't see that. They saw a master over them. And so where Moses was, it was where he had to change to reflect who Israel was. He went to Israel to try and be the deliverer to them that he knew he was called to be. But his actions caused him to be rejected. He was not recognized in the call and in the purpose that God intended for his life, because the identity he had in him, his actions, his self-promotion, his self-will, caused him to be seen so differently from what the call and the purpose was. The identity of the call and the purpose, that he could not be recognized, which is why God had to send him to the backside of the desert, in a place where his hiding place is what made him into the deliverer, caused him to take on the character of the deliverer that would identify him in his calling, caused him to take on all the characteristics, the mannerisms, the behavior, to cause him to look like whom God had called him to be, to cause him to be recognized by the people he was sent to cause him to be able to be among them, to look like them, to seem like them, to behave like them, so he could be seen in the light of his calling, and not as the enemy who came to destroy and to kill, to put them under his feet and to subject and subdue them. That is what they saw him as when he was killing an Egyptian and parting a fight. He thought he was parting a fight, but him parting the fight told them his ability to separate them. It told them the power he had over them. It didn't show him as being a helper. God's will has to be done in the light of the calling. That is why his will requires his way. Moses being in the backside of the desert is what identified Moses with God's will. Another time, I will come to you with another episode of how Moses was able to keep moving in the will of God, how God created another chapter in Moses' life to cause a new direction in his life. Thank you again for listening to Cuidado, the podcast that helps you to win in life. Come back and listen to the next episode. Subscribe to our podcast so you can keep growing and learning how to overcome pitfalls and to move forward out of those pitfalls to grow, to win. Thank you. God bless. Love you.